A full panel, which is amazing. So welcome everyone. Welcome to our Side of Wind Win-Win for Climate and Gender Justice, acting on military spending and military emissions. My name is Michelle Bensing. I'm an environment consultant with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and I have the honor to moderate this crucial side event here at COP28, jointly organized by Drexel University, Tipping Point North-South, and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. This official side event here at COP28 will explore militarization as one of the root causes of the two biggest threats to human survival: the climate crisis and war. It will further make a strong case for demilitarization, for climate and gender justice and peace. And before we get started with this incredible panel that we have here with us today, I just want to set the scene a little bit for all of us. Humanity is at a crossroads. As we only have a few years left to avoid ecological collapse, governments are involved in ever-increasing numbers of wars and conflict. Between 2010 and 2020, conflict has almost doubled, from around 30 to 56, and evidence shows that this categorically actually accelerates the climate breakdown. Yesterday, on December 3rd, for the first time at a COP, we had a day on health, relief, recovery, and peace. And the COP28 presidency launched a declaration on climate, relief, recovery, and peace, as well as a package of solutions. While the mobilization of climate action, and particularly climate finance in conflict-affected regions, is crucial, the declaration completely neglects one of the root causes of both the climate crisis and conflict. And this is the elephant in the room that we also want to address today: rampant militarization. The global military is a driver of the climate crisis, contributing around 5.5% to global greenhouse gas emission. And this figure doesn't even include conflict emissions, which come on top. Estimates put Russia's invasion of Ukraine in its first year as comparable with the greenhouse gas emissions of a country the size of Belgium. And we are still awaiting the data on Gaza. However, reporting military emissions under the UNFCCC is actually voluntary, resulting in a lack of accountability and also transparency. Meanwhile, evidence also shows that global military emissions highly correlate with high military spending. We do know that military spending is at a record high, with around 2.24 trillion of global military spending in 2022 that was provided to finance the military, and actually would have needed to be put into the 100 billion target of annual climate finance to low-income countries, which has not been fulfilled to date. Yet all this discussion is largely ignored in these climate negotiation halls. Therefore, this event will center calls for demilitarization, for climate justice and gender justice, because the impacts of the militarization are a major, significant contributor to this climate crisis. But some of you might actually wonder and ask, what do we mean by demilitarization? It's like a term we put out there over and over again in actions and calls. But let me just clarify a little bit what are key demands of demilitarization. It firstly includes transparency and accountability of the ecological impact of the military and conflicts, meaning also transparency in emissions reporting. It means the implementation of international disarmament and arms control treaties. The reallocation of military spending to gender transformative climate action, to climate mitigation, adaptation, and the loss and damage fund. Investment into diplomacy and environmental peace building. And the uplifting of intersectional feminist analysis of what peace actually means, what human security actually means. And lastly, a just transition away from the war economies that we're facing right now towards green care economies that actually at their heart and center have the regeneration of our planet. And for this, we do need an intersectional feminist analysis, which is a tool actually to understand the systems of oppression that exist, by which we mean the patriarchy, militarism, and also exploitative capitalist systems. Our diverse set of panelists today will actually dive deeper a little bit into these different areas and key topics that I just highlighted, and will also give us some pathways and entry points for the climate negotiations and highlight the gaps. Furthermore, our speakers will also share from their lived experience of the impacts of militarization and the climate crisis in their contexts, and also highlight key solutions and also feminist analysis and a vision. So without further ado, I really know you're not here to listen to me, just wanted to set the scene. I really want to hand over to our first speaker. So our first speaker is Deborah Burton. Deborah has a wide-ranging experience across economic justice campaigns such as trade and tax justice, also children's human rights and women's health and environment. She leads on Tipping Point's North-South primary policy advocacy project Transform Defense, focusing on military missions and spending, climate change and climate finance, UN processes, and wider foreign policy thinking. Deborah, as I just said, in 2022, global military expenditure actually reached an unprecedented high of the 2.24 trillion. And we do know that the richest countries that are most contributing to the climate crisis are actually spending 30 times more to their militaries than they do to mandatory climate finance. So could you please elaborate a little bit more on the links between military spending and climate finance? Thank you. I think, yeah, maybe, and I come over you.
It's been a marathon to get here. I'm happy to sit down. Lovely. Now, is this, okay. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you. And thanks everybody for being here today. It really feels that, I say with every COP, really since Glasgow COP in COP26, that we are really making progress with all our collective efforts, everybody that's working on this topic, in terms of raising the issue of military emissions and military spending inside these communities. The global military emissions in peace and war is now in the spotlight. It is. The next toughest steps are transparency, accountability, and urgent action for those heavily reliant fossil fuel militaries to do as all sectors must, which is to decarbonize. And yet, as we move ever more into global boiling, as we continue to accelerate mass extinction across biodiversity, war continues apace. Military emissions in conflict finally hit home as the world watched the Russian invasion of Ukraine unfold. Today, we are here, the world watching again, this time the suffering of 2 million Palestinians in Gaza under non-stop bombardment. Bombardment that also devastates infrastructure, environment, and, as in Ukraine, and all conflicts, in fact, with this level of intensity, it just keeps adding to the greenhouse gas emissions burden also. So why is military spending a major threat to climate justice? Well, firstly, because the emissions story is wrapped inside another story, and that is runaway military spending. As Michelle says, it's currently sitting at $2.2 trillion annually, and it is rising steeply as a result of Ukraine and Gaza. There is a correlation between military spending and emissions. The more you spend on big-ticket military equipment, the more military emissions. The global military and their supply chain, as Michelle says, that's the arms industry, are responsible, combined, for at least 5.5% of global emissions. That is more than the 52 countries of the African continent combined, at 3.8%. It is more than civilian aviation and shipping combined, and it does not include conflict emissions. Secondly, it's poor value for money. It diverts money from climate finance. Over the next 6 years, to the point where we must hit 45% cuts to annual greenhouse gas emissions, the global military will have received approximately $13 trillion from our governments. $13 trillion. And the G20 nations will account for approximately 87% of that. So we just need to think what we could do with just 10%, 20%, 30% or more of that 13 trillion. This ever-rising military spending is diverting funds from climate finance, funds that rich countries are legally bound to deliver and are failing to do. For COP last year, our organisation, Tipping Point North-South, together with Transnational Institute and Stop Wop and Handle in the Netherlands, we released a report called Climate Collateral, How Military Spending Accelerates Climate Breakdown. In it, we found that the richest countries, Annex 2 in the UN talks, are indeed spending 30 times as much on their armed forces as they spend on providing climate finance for the world's most vulnerable countries. For COP this year, we have published a follow-up report called Climate Crossfire, and that's looking at the impact of the 2% of GDP target that NATO expects its 31 members to spend on their militaries. Bearing in mind, we have that 6 years to go before we meet the 45% target, NATO countries are moving in the exact opposite direction with this 2% target. This current year, NATO countries account for approximately 50% of global military spending. So NATO's spending this year comes in at 1.26 trillion, and it would pay for 12 years of the promised climate finance at $100 billion a year. If all NATO members, and the numbers that are meeting this 2% of GDP, I think it's up to 11 at the moment, the numbers are rising. If all NATO members were to meet its 2% military spending targets, between an 8-year period, let's say 2021 to 2028, to meet that target from where we are now to where NATO would like it to be, those countries need to find an additional $2.57 trillion. So finally, as we watch on our televisions those fossil fuel hungry fighter jets, tanks, bombs and missiles that rain down on civilians, we need to be reminded that much of that military spending, our taxes, are going into the profit margins of the weapons industry. Wars in Ukraine and Gaza are boosting profits and shareholder dividends, while Palestine, as Iraq, as Afghanistan before it, face the terrible collision of human and environmental devastation of war, while all the time on the front line of the climate emergency. So to conclude, as we head towards the almost certain conclusion that we will breach 2 degrees in the coming decades, are we left to conclude that climate goals are being put second to military objectives? And if military spending broadly correlates to military emissions, then surely these ever-rising levels of military spending in a climate emergency are utterly incompatible with climate targets. Is military spending a major threat to climate justice? Ask it the other way around. Is it helping reach net zero targets? Is it diverting big money from climate finance that we are obligated to pay? Is it getting humanity to a better place? Or has the time come for civil society to up the ante on calling for cuts, not increases, cuts to military spending on the grounds of both emissions and climate finance? Has the time come for us all to expect a progressive transformation of foreign and defense policy through the lens of the climate emergency, one that is fit for the 21st century and generations to come? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah, for your powerful words. I'm just remembering, as you just said, think of what we could do with 10%, 20%, 30% of all that military spending. I think that allows for a vision that we could established together as well. Next, I would like to hand over to Dr. Nita Crawford, who is a Montague Burton Chair in International Relations at Oxford University. Nita was elected a member of both the British Academy and the American Academy of Arts and Science in 2023. Professor Crawford's most recent book, The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, has won the American Book Award. She has authored several other books, including Accountability for Killing, Moral Responsibility for Collateral Damage in America's Post-9/11 Wars. She is also co-founder and co-director of the Cost of War project based at Brown University. Dr. Nita Crawford, we just heard about the 2.24 trillion in military spending in 2022, but of that, by far, the largest proportion comes from the US. And the US military also has a massive carbon footprint. If the US military were seen as a country, it would be the 47th largest emitter in greenhouse gases in the world. Can you talk about the role of the US in contributing to the climate crisis and how it relates to its responsibility in international climate change negotiations?
Thank you. Okay, so I want to be really clear about two things. First, military spending is supposed to be related to the threats and the risks that people face, right? It's meant to, the military spending is meant to procure the forces and the intellectual and material capacity to deter war and fight war if necessary. Now, what we see, though, is that the risk of climate change is 100%. The risk of war at any one time is actually low. So what we have to think about is how is it that we're balancing risks? So that's the first thing I want to do. And then the second thing I want to answer your question. So U.S. military spending is unmoored, essentially, from operations and from threats. A large portion of the spending is for personnel, but it's also for equipment and operations and installations and exercises. Okay, so the problem with military spending is not just the opportunity costs that Deborah Burton has outlined. We tend to spend less on diplomacy and other programs that could alleviate the risk of conflict, but it's also an opportunity cost in the economic sense in that it produces fewer jobs than, let's say, green energy or teaching or healthcare. It decreases the amount of money that's put into civil innovation and research. And this is especially the case in the United States, where you look at where most R&D has gone. It's gone for things which are not going to help us get out of the climate crisis in the last 25 years, despite, actually the last 45 years, despite the claim that we're concerned about energy and climate. So it distorts and shapes economies. There's fewer spin-offs than you think, and it is extremely inefficient in terms of producing whatever spin-offs it does produce. So it drives cycles of spending as well among allies, as we've seen with NATO's increased commitment to military spending, and adversaries, as you see China respond to the United States, pivot to Asia. It decreases democratic accountability because we don't tend to scrutinize it, at least in the US. Patriotism trumps intelligent conversation about what foreign policy objectives should be and what military spending ought to be. It's associated, of course, with higher emissions, and I want to talk a little bit about those emissions before I get to what I think we ought to be doing. So, you know that military emissions really come in several forms. One is the direct emissions of operations, including training and installations, and purchased energy is another form of emissions related to the military, that is scope 2. Then there's, of course, the destruction of natural and built environment. And what you do when you destroy a forest in war or a wetland is you take carbon sequestration capacity out. And what you have is a double loss. Okay, so the average emissions of the United States between 1975 and 2022 were 81 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Now, those emissions have tracked war and military spending, both. So the peaks that I have calculated were 1975 and 1991, where in 1975 it was 109 million metric tons CO2 equivalent, which is of course larger than most countries in the world and many countries combined. And then 1991, 110 million metric tons CO2 equivalent, which was related to the war in Iraq at that point. And then, of course, in 2004, it was 85 million metric ton CO2 equivalent. Why do past emissions matter? Well, of course, we know because emissions stay in the atmosphere sometimes for hundreds of years. If you're talking about fluorinated gases, thousands, potentially thousands of years. So we don't know the total military emissions since the 19th century. We need to keep in mind that those military emissions were part of an economy that drove a certain kind of development and a certain need to have bases to get the oil to provide the capacity to make more war. So basically the trends are between 1975 and 1991, it was average of 103 million metric tons per year. Between 2001 and 2022, it's an average of 70 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So what I'm telling you is the story of it going down, but what it really is that military emissions wax and wane with conflict and peak in the years of peak conflict. So then, next question, how does the military understand climate change? First of all, it funded the research starting in the 1940s and 50s, which gave us the understanding of most of the basic science. So Roger Revelle, Hans Suess, Keeling, and others were funded by the Office of Naval Research. In the 1950s and 60s, they published reports which detail both their interest in the military consequences, the foreign policy consequences of climate change, especially in the Arctic, a concern for what would happen if the seas were open 12 months a year. And these same concerns are repeated in the following decades, right? So the fact that I had to calculate some of the emissions that I'm telling you about is because emissions were omitted from reporting at Kyoto. And they're at the request of the United States military, run through Stuart Eisenstadt, the chief negotiator. So this is most military emissions are omitted, including bunker fuels and operations, multilateral operations. Now, so on the one hand, they understood the problem, and on the other hand, they didn't want to tell us their role. And in fact, they didn't want to tell us their role because they argued in 1997 and 98 in statements to the Clinton administration that even a 10% cut in emissions would be devastating for operations and American military preeminence, that is global domination. So the third thing we need to know about the military is that they're greening itself, the supply chain, and innovations, and their emissions, as I said, have gone down. But the greening, for example, renewable energy use is less than 1% a reduction in their total emissions. So the greening is essentially cosmetic, and I just want to point out that the DoD's has stated, each branch has given us ambitions. For instance, the Army says it will cut by 50% its emissions from a 2005 baseline. Of course, when they tell you that, they don't tell you the baseline number. And they have already, just between 2010 and 2019, reduced emissions by 42%. So they're very close to or already have met their emissions reduction goals. I could go on, but the most important thing I'll say now is that the military also sees the climate as a security threat, as a threat multiplier. And this is a narrative which is both interesting and potentially counterproductive, in the sense that the links that they're making between climate change and increased security risks are in fact tenuous, but yet they'll argue that they need to be prepared for increasing geopolitical tensions, unilateral efforts to deploy geoengineering, and what shall we do about those? And then increasing tension at borders as nations take steps to secure their interests and resources. So that's how they understand climate change as a security threat. Now, when you understand climate change as a security threat, you're militarizing it or securitizing it, as we say in the academy. And to do that is to give potentially carte blanche to the military to increase their role. Now, the problem with all of that is if we then say that militaries should be helping us solve the climate problem, we have to recall that this is an extremely inefficient way to solve climate. Okay, so for instance, the Marines have a research facility, the U.S. Marines, where they're developing alternative batteries and portable solar power, and it's brilliant, exciting work. But guess what? That's extremely inefficient, and the civilian sector could do this work already. In fact, what we know is that they sometimes just say, oh, we can't do that, we'll just buy it off the shelf. Well, if we're investing in the military to do this innovation, then what we're doing is we're actually creating an inefficiency in the system that does not help us actually get out of the situation that we're in. So I think I've basically exhausted my time and probably exhausted you with a lot of data. And what I want to conclude with is my sense that we know everything we need to know about military emissions. They're large. They stay in the atmosphere like every other kind of emission a long time. They're essentially, in many cases, unnecessary to the extent that there are real security threats, such as the potential for China to invade Taiwan, such as border conflicts, such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We should not, A, overreact by increasing military spending, especially against Russia, which is a much weaker power than when they began the conflict. So we're increasing our capacity at the same time that this adversary is decreasing its capacity foolishly. And then the other thing that we need to do is we need to rethink by closing bases and changing military doctrine. We need to rethink the legacy postures that the United States has with its more than 700 overseas installations and bases, and those doctrines which are, in fact, potentially increasing tensions between countries, and those doctrines should be rethought. So there are real security threats, but we can meet them at much lower levels of force and with more innovative foreign policies and military doctrines.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Nita Grafford, also again for this summary at the end of the key points, and also for addressing the militarization of the climate crisis that we're currently also seeing, that also results, for example, in the securitization of borders. I want to pass on the time now to our next speaker, Mitzi Janelle Tan. Mitzi is a full-time climate justice activist from the Philippines. They are an organizer with Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines and Fridays for Future MAPA, Most Affected People and Areas. She is guided by the principles of anti-imperialism, anti-colonization, collective action, love, and joy. In a paper titled Feminist Interventions Resisting the Militarization of the Climate Crisis by the Women's Environment and Development Organization and the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, you said that the militarization of the climate crisis is actually a distraction from the proliferation of fossil fuels. Could you please elaborate on that point that you made and also touch upon the impacts of the US military within the Philippines? Thank you.
Thank you. I say that the militarization of the climate crisis is a distraction because so many times the governments of the world see that the military is the response to the climate crisis. That's how you solve it, by adding more emissions because there's more conflict. But then that ignores the fact, the science-based fact, which some people in this area do not believe in, that the fossil fuels are the reason and one of the biggest reasons and drivers of the climate crisis. And they say that militarization is the answer because, again, it's because about security, border control, etc. But then when we're talking about climate refugees and political refugees, we need to remember who is making our countries unlivable? Who is making our countries unstable? Who is making our countries not safe from the climate crisis and from political crises? I want to start my story 77 years ago. 77 years ago, in 1946, the Philippines gained independence from the US. We were colonized for 48 years, but then until today, the US still has control of our politics, our economy, our military, our culture. Our constitution is in English, our policies are heavily guided by the US, and our military is trained by the US. And I say this and I start here because we've already talked a lot about the connection of the climate crisis and militarization, and I was going to say the same talking points. But now I want to look at why is the military doing this? Why are they continuing to do this? It's because they're protecting profit. It's because they're protecting the status quo, and it's the same reason why we see that with climate action, finance flows so slowly. In the first day of COP, we have the loss and damage fund operationalized, which is only thanks to civil society. And the US, embarrassingly, frustratingly, and infuriatingly, only pledged $17.5 million US. I would expect them to, at the very least, match the other countries. Like, I thought they had enough ego to do that. Like, oh, I can't be outmatched by these people. But no, they just put up $17 million US despite investing billions in militarization. And then, we've seen their negotiators, John Kerry, even at some point saying over and over that they can't afford this. That the country who has historically been the largest emitter of the climate crisis without even counting their military emissions, because again, they've lobbied to keep it out of accountability, can't afford loss and damage finance, reparations that they need. And that's because they can afford militarization and military, and it's so fast for them to shell out funds that way because it protects them. It protects their profit. It protects their safety, their security, their positions of power, the status quo, the system that we have today. And what doesn't protect that? Climate action, climate justice. That is a direct threat to the security of the people in power. That is a direct threat to the profits that they're earning. It is a direct threat to the status quo that has caused the crisis that we're in. And so when we're talking about demilitarizing, it really is about also figuring out who are they protecting and changing that. Because that is where this is starting. It's this imperialist, profit-oriented system that the military is really just so hooked on. This year alone, we have at least 5 that we know of new military bases planned in the US. And when it was the colonization of the US 48 years ago, there was a time when it was also Japan, because that was during the World War II. And we became a pawn in their imperialist war, and we're seeing that it might happen again with China coming up in the Philippines. And when it all boils down, when you look at what the US military is actually doing, they're saying that they're trying to protect us. We need to have these US military bases, but if you look at these bases, what are they actually doing? They're destroying the forests, they're destroying biodiversity, they're disposing of hazardous toxic waste that's destroying biodiversity and causing health impacts in the surrounding communities, and they're training our military. And what does that military training look like? It makes us, the Philippines, the most dangerous country in Asia for environmental defenders and activists in the past 10 years. Makes us the 3rd most dangerous country in the world. And this is not secluded to the Philippines. Across the world, this militarization is one of the biggest reasons behind environmental defenders' deaths. And why? Because, again, environmental defenders are going up against the multinational companies that are destroying land, ocean, forests. And who's protecting that? Who's protecting the destruction of the environment? The military. The anti-terrorism, the US military frames it often as counter-terrorism. And in the Philippines, who they tag as terrorists or activists. Just earlier this year, 2 young women were abducted by the military. Their names are Jed Castro and Janila Tamano. And they were made to sign a statement within the military camp that they are surrenderies, they're rebel surrenderies. And of course they're going to sign it because they're in the middle of a military camp with their lives in danger. When they were put on a press conference organized by the military and they had the courage and bravery to tell the truth, and of course they tried to stop the press conference, but they couldn't. Now they're facing cases of perjury and their lives are still in trouble. Last year, a volunteer teacher to indigenous schools in the Philippines was killed and called a terrorist. He is my friend, his name is Chad Pook, and that was by the military. That is what the US military industrial complex and the military industrial complex across the world looks like. It's not only causing to the climate crisis, it's not only causing more conflict and making countries more vulnerable to the climate crisis, it's killing environmental defenders and climate activists who are going up against the climate crisis. And so when we talk about the threats of militarization, again, I'm going to repeat my statement, we need to look at the threat of who they're protecting and ensure that that is part of the conversation. Because otherwise, maybe we have a more, I don't think so, but more humane military. But then if they're still protecting the status quo, if the status quo remains, then we're still going to be in this crisis that we are in today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mitzi. And yes, I want to also repeat that sentence as you just mentioned. Who are they protecting, right? And also the question of, that you said climate action is actually a threat to their power and to their system and to their own interest. And thank you so much for also highlighting the impacts on environmental defenders in order to stand in solidarity with them and also the lives lost due to the military. I would like to go next to Christy, our next speaker. Dr. Christy Kelly is a socialist specializing in politics of knowledge, feminist theory, gender mainstreaming, and transnational feminism in Southeast Asia. She has lived and worked in Vietnam since the early 1990s. Her most recent collaboration is with feminist activists, combating corruption and also climate change. Bring us to full circle. So we just heard about the militarization that's ongoing through the US. We heard the impacts on environmental defenders in the Philippines, but also in the world, of course. What are, when we are looking at the American war in Vietnam, ended nearly 50 years ago, what are the issues that feminist activists on the ground are still dealing with until today?
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you all for being here today. Oops, do I turn it on? There we go. Sorry about that. Thank you, everyone. So today I want to talk about the long-term cost of war and its link to climate change and corruption. The American war in Vietnam devastated that nation beyond the horrendous death toll. Nearly 50 years later, the effects are still real. New war technologies were introduced, contributing to Vietnam's ecological change from a once pristine habitat to an almost apocalyptic state. Chemicals such as Agent Orange and napalm were used to clear large areas of land. It destroyed crops, deforested jungle, and ruined agricultural land and drinking water. Roam plows were used to clear forest, killing massive numbers of animals and vegetation, and caused erosion, which contributes to flooding and landslides today. New bombs released sharp metal scraps that killed not only enemy forces, but large numbers of wildlife. The damages to the environment have proved irreversible. Many species of animals and vegetation were greatly reduced, and in some cases became extinct. Dioxin in surface runoff clung to sediment particles and settled in wetlands, marshes, rivers, lakes, and ponds. Contaminated sediment was and still is ingested by bottom-feeding fish and shrimp, accumulating in fatty tissues of those animals and up the food chain into the many fish that form the basis of the Vietnamese diet and its export industry. Even though fishing is now banned from most contaminated sites, bans have been difficult to enforce, and as a result, dioxin is still entering the human food supply 50 years later. Exposure to these dioxins is the cause of an abnormally high incidence of miscarriages, skin diseases, cancers, birth defects, and congenital malformations, often extreme and grotesque. The Vietnam Red Cross estimates that 3 million Vietnamese have been affected by dioxin, including at least 150,000 children born after the war with serious birth defects. Women are left to manage the extensive care work for children and other relatives who are impacted. Of course, it goes without saying that neither the US government nor US manufacturers have been held accountable in court for the harmful effects of Agent Orange. It's obvious why many point to Vietnam as one of the clearest examples of environmental damage during warfare. Today, Vietnam is listed as one of the world's 5 most vulnerable countries to climate change. Yet when I search for media reports and studies on climate change, few, if any, mention the impact of war. Instead, they note Vietnam's unique geographical position as producing vulnerability. Typhoons, floods, droughts, and landslides frequently threaten communities living along the dense coast and in the Mekong Delta. These are exacerbated by rapid growth and development, particularly in industries such as construction, transportation, and manufacturing, all known environmental polluters. Vietnam is now struggling with alarming air pollution. Its 2 biggest cities, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, are among the top 15 polluted cities in the region. Finer particles are particularly harmful to human health as they can penetrate deep into the lungs and cardiovascular system, causing diseases including stroke, heart disease, lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, and respiratory infections. Up to 60,000 deaths in Vietnam in 2016 were related to air pollution. Vietnam is also among 5 countries in the world that account for nearly 60% of the ocean's plastic pollution. Plastic pollution exacerbates the impacts of climate change as it harms marine life, disrupting life-sustaining ecosystems. To begin addressing these issues in 2021, Vietnam announced at COP26 a target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Money is now flowing in from donors to help. This includes the US, which has invested nearly $1 billion, with a B, for climate adaptation and new investments in renewable energy, biodiversity, conservation, and sustainable landscapes. But activists call for monitoring mechanisms to make sure these monies reach intended communities and not skimmed off as they flow downward through complex bureaucratic hierarchies. At the same time, Vietnam is ramping up its own military. It is in a decades-long dispute with China over the South China Sea, or the East Sea as Vietnam calls it. As it buys weapons from Russia, bribed to do so actually, India, Spain, Japan, and of course the US, it has become one of the best armed countries in Southeast Asia. Increased militarization is disabling peace in the region, as my colleague from the Philippines just told us. And military missions remain hidden or underreported at best, so it's difficult to know the real impact on the climate. This lack of transparency is clearly a form of climate corruption. Climate activists in Vietnam have taken the lead on educating youth, rural communities, and indigenous communities on environmental issues, including climate change, plastic waste, the illegal wildfire trade, and air pollution. With first-hand experience of war and its environmental and human costs and rapid development, they express concern that the country is not doing enough to meet its target of net zero emissions. Rather than being awarded or rewarded for their activism, they are being silenced, one by one. At least 5 internationally recognized climate activists have been jailed on tax evasion charges in recent years. They are all women. Evidence suggests others have begun redirecting their work away from climate issues or being compelled to disband their NGOs completely. It's time we recognize the war-climate corruption nexus as a feminist issue. The US military remains the world's top funded and the world's largest institutional emitter. Vietnam is now the best armed country in Southeast Asia. Corruption, in the guise of protecting state secrets, is why we have no emissions transparency data by militarized states. And yet, trumped-up corruption charges are being used to silence climate change activists trying to hold their governments accountable to agreements made at COP. We can do better than this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christy. Thank you for highlighting also solutions that climate activists in Vietnam are driving forward, solutions such as education, raising and putting the topic on the agenda while they are being silenced, and also for highlighting that we will have to put the war, climate, corruption nexus into the center to hold also governments accountable. Thank you so much for your input. With that, I want to hand over to a fellow activist here, who's also part of our WILPF delegation, actually, Nesma Mansour, an advocacy officer of Peace Track Initiative. She is a women's peace and security expert and a founding member of PTI. She specializes in international peace building and also climate justice. And it is also PTI's focal point for feminist climate justice issues. It's so great to have you here, Nesma. So women are championing peace, demilitarization, and also climate justice solutions from the local, as we also just heard in the case of Vietnam, to the international level. It is essential to amplify the demands also in climate negotiations and policy making, and as well international agreements. You are part of the MENA Feminist Task Force that also together put forward a set of recommendations for this COP28. Part of this was actually also the topic of demilitarization. What are your specific demands on demilitarization, and could you elaborate, please, a little bit more on these MENA feminist demands? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. So, yes, indeed, I am part of the Feminist MENA Task Force that is part of the WGC work. So, as part of the MENA Feminists, we are calling for a climate action that is intersectional, decolonial, anti-racist, and gender transformative. We don't want gender adapted anymore. We really want advocate for transformation. So this means that we want to address the roots of injustice and inequality in order to break these power relations in our context. So we have heard about the 13 trillion US dollars, which I don't know how many zeros are in this number, and MENA governments are equally guilty in this race to militarization. So together with my MENA fellows, we have worked on defining 6 priorities for the climate action and to achieve feminist climate justice. So we focused on inclusive climate engagement, on climate finance, and as you have mentioned, Michelle, we focus about conflict-affected countries because we are in a region that has many countries going through war for a decade, militarization and peace building. We have also focused on climate adaptation, resilience, disaster risk reduction, education, capacity strengthening, and the last thematic that we focused on was green economy, just energy transition. So in terms of demilitarization, we have focused on 4 main thematics in this issue. So the first is having an intersectional approach to address the conflict and climate change nexus. This intersectional approach that links the climate justice agenda to the women peace and security agenda and the youth and peace and security agenda. And from experience as a fellow peace builder that is working on the Yemen peace process for a very long time than it should be. We should have achieved peace by now, but it's just didn't happen. There is a complete ignore of the issue of the destruction of the environment that is happening through the active conflict. We have more than 2 million mines are planted in the ground. We have 70% of the population that is dependent on agriculture, and 80% of them who are women are losing their source of income, and we are not addressing this issue. We want to end conflict, we do not want to achieve peace, and we don't want to address the root causes of sometimes these conflicts, which are related to the climate-induced conflicts. So addressing the issue of climate justice from an intersectional approach is indispensable to be able to dismantle this big issue. The second thematic we wanted to address is of course, we cannot talk about building peace, demilitarizing, and not address the issue of gender-based violence. And gender-based violence is exacerbating when it comes to conflict settings. So we have right now 2 layers. We have gender-based violence that is increasing because of conflict, and on top of it, we have climate-induced gender-based violence. So violence has been increasing, and its sources have been increasing. So we cannot say that we want peace or demilitarization without addressing the root causes of gender-based violence, and also without addressing that women have different needs. For example, there is a very recent example, which are the floods that have hit the city of Derna in Libya. So our Libyan colleague have told us that when it came to response, women needs were left aside. No one talked about how we are going to protect these women from violence. No one really addressed what do they need. We are looking at climate disaster aid as a whole, and not responding to the needs in the ground. So in order to do this, as MENA feminists, we are demanding that gender-based violence is addressed in longer-term mechanisms and longer-term legal mechanisms, because women, and as I mentioned, women and marginalized groups are already vulnerable from conflict, and with the increasing climate crisis, they are having double the vulnerabilities. As a fourth thematic, we are calling for enhancing the climate action and improving the conflict prevention by improving the transboundary agreements, because again, we are still in a highly conflicted area, an area where access to resources is very complicated. Water scarcity has been one of the main issues. And lastly, the calls is also going through the question of reporting and the military-induced gas emissions. MENA is being held in the loop of vicious cycle of balancing of power, of my neighbor is buying more arms, so I am buying more arms, and then we're going to buy more arms. And the statistics are horrifying. So in an average, countries, and we're talking about even the poorest. So I was looking at data. So Yemen in 2014, being one of the poorest nations in MENA region, spent 4.6% of its GDP in armament. And MENA defense budgets rose 3.3% in 2023, and they are expected to raise in 2024 by even 4%. So we are talking about $238 billion being spent on military. And it's going to increase because of what I told you, this vicious cycle of trying to balance the power and trying to be the stronger to defend themselves. This money is being diverted from exploring peaceful solutions, from diplomatic solutions, to looking at solving the geopolitical issues only by military means. So, as my colleagues have mentioned, and I will not repeat it, we are losing lots of resources, and not just this. Governments are prioritizing militarizing and increasing their military budget, and ignoring other issues when we are talking about countries that are the poorest in the world. So it is very scary that we are just going to keep being stuck in this vicious cycle. So we are calling for reinvestment of these resources towards peace action, towards finance, towards adaptation, resilience, mitigation, and also to look at the issue of the the peace building in the region as an intersectional issue, and not just only we want to build peace. No, we want to build peace and also address one of the conflict main sources, which is climate-induced conflict. So this is in a nutshell what we as MENA feminists have been discussing about, have been talking about, and I'm sure that there are so many gender-specific examples, and I will end my intervention by giving you the example of the cyclone that have hit the east part of Yemen that is neighboring Oman. So two main cities, Al-Mahra cities and Salalah city. Salalah in Oman has the sufficient infrastructure, the country has had a plan to evacuate people, take them to the safe spaces. None was killed. None was killed and no one was lost. While in the other neighboring city of Al-Mahra, we had 100,000 people who are displaced, thousands who have lost their means of living, and infrastructure that has completely been destroyed. So being in ongoing conflicts increase vulnerability, and if the international peace building mechanism does not address the issue of climate and does not put it in the center of its action, we're just going to see more and more devastated effects. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nesma, for sharing these thoughts with us and for also making clear again, it's about a prioritization. And as long as we prioritize military spending over exploring peaceful and also gender transformative, as you mentioned, and climate just solutions, we will not have the sustainable peace that we actually need. And thanks as well for highlighting that there is no demilitarization without addressing gender-based violence. It's a key issue when we talk about demilitarization. So next I want to hand over to also a fellow WILPF delegate here at this COP28. Rula Assad is a feminist researcher and journalist. She is the co-founder of Stitching Female Journalist Network. With over 2 decades of experience, she brings dedication to decolonial and also intersectional feminist perspectives, spanning roles as a manager, as a teacher, facilitator, and also mentor. Her experiences encompasses media and feminist women's rights movements, nonprofit management, with a specialized focus on feminist media, digital rights, and addressing environmental crises in West South Asia and North Africa. Rula, could you share some of your lived experiences of the impacts of militarization and the climate crisis in Syria with us, and also further elaborate on the focus that you bring to this COP28 on demilitarization for gender and climate justice?
Thank you, Michelle. Actually, I will answer these 2 questions through the context of Syria, because I come from Syria, but I'm not living in Syria since already 12 years. And I feel like still Syria, when it comes to militarization and demilitarization, yet untold the story. And if I want to look to what's happening in Syria today, like just to take Syria context, I see like there is the militarization have been used, but the result, everyone knows, like there's a lot of heavy militarized conflict happening in Syria since 2011, but also back in the time since Hafiz al-Assad, the president, the father of Bashar al-Assad, have took the country under a military coup in 1970. Actually, there is the result of the Syria story. It's racism all over the world because of the Syrian refugee. It's sectarianism within the region when we talk about Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan. It is also racism when it comes to the region in Lebanon against Syrian refugee, or in Turkey, for example. It's classism, it's colonialism, it's a new colonialism when we look to the Russia role in the Syrian conflict. Actually, militarism in my daily life started when I was 7 years old, when I had to go to the school with this kind of uniform, and it's quite militarized, like it's this khaki color. And then in the high school, like we have literally, it's something very close to the military uniform. And my thesis in the master was about the impact of militarization on women body and gender identity. So there's a lot to talk about there, but I want to focus more on what's happening in Syria nowadays. I want to say, like, we talk a lot about Ukrainian war, but I want to drop an idea here that Russia had been tested a lot of women in Syria before using them in Ukraine. They tested in Idlib, northeast Syria. They use a certain cluster munition that it's killed, but also remain people fear of being killed or being disabled. And that reminds me of biopolitics and biopower, like have been used in the Syrian war. If necropolitics also have been used, like already in Palestine from the Israeli state, but also we see examples in Syria. And actually, this militarization in the region, especially when I talk about Assad, it's about who has the right to live and who is going to be die. But also, as Jasper Poir said, in referring to the war on Gaza, not recent one, like Israeli army have been used a technique not to kill Palestinian young men, but to make them disabled by just shooting them in the knees. And similar example happened in Syria. So today we are talking about militarization. We are talking about also disabilities with the country that doesn't have any infrastructure for able bodies. So let's think about disabled bodies as well in the space. Also, I want to highlight in 2014 that Bashar al-Assad used the sarin gas in Ghouta al-Sharqiyya near to Damascus. And there were big, huge red lines from Obama at that time, but nothing happened. And what happened, actually, they transformed this gas to Lebanon to be then transferred to Denmark, because Denmark said, like, we're going to destroy this chemical weapon. I don't know where they destroy it. I mean, if they destroy it in the ocean, it's another question. So, I mean, the Syria story when it comes to militarization, it's cross-border, as many other places. It's not about only the Syrian. It's not only about having refugee in Europe and it's a card to be played over and over from many Western countries. It's not about just like what's happening in Lebanon now. It's a country like suffering from many, a climate crisis, and then they make the Syrian refugee card as a distraction to what's happening as a politician. And we go back again to the conflict, and we go back to the arms, and we go back to like a certain dictatorship have been armed over and over the years, but the word, since it's not like it's there, it's away from us, no one cares. So I think also when we talk about demilitarization, not to look only about global north, but also global south, when there is a peace in two brackets time, when the governments and authoritarian states, they are like armed themselves and be prepared for, as Nesma said, like, if my neighbor get armed, I will get armed, and so on, which is very patriarchal practice as well. So we go again to patriarchy. I just mentioned a few of the example of the like how during the Syrian conflict have been like several weapons have been used and tested, but that means that today we also have a very low quality of food, a low quality of water. The chemical weapon have been used in Ghouta al-Sharqiyya. It's affect the ground, and it's one of the very good earth for agriculture, and nowadays people, they are not able to use it. We talk about using water as a weapon of war when it go to Euphrates, in particular river, when Turkish government decide to cut the water to the Kurdish area. So also here we are talking about sectarianism and how ethnical group have been affected by all this power using weapon or using this masculine militarized state figures and presidents. So water is another issue in Syria. Food, another issue, as I mentioned, like destroying forest. And since the conflict started till today, Syria have been lost 75% from the forest. So Syria, it's a green area, but also there is desert, and desertification is happening now. It's the landscape of Syria, more or less. From my lived experience as well, I would say I didn't leave Syria by choice. I thought I'm gonna back to Syria after 3 months, but after the 3 months became 12 years. And I'm not the only one, and I have kind of luxury how at the timing I've left the country. Because I still, for example, hear a lot of stories from my comrades, from my friends, other feminist friends that have been to displaced 3 times within the country before leaving, before crossing the border to Turkey or Lebanon or Jordan and then to Europe, for example. We are talking about like generational PTSD nowadays. It's like it's in our body, we cannot ignore it anymore. We are talking about generation that they already burn out of everything. We are talking about friends I have lost because of explosion of a tank, a brother who I lost because of a bullet. A lot of comrades, they have been died because they have been targeted because they were asking like for just basic human rights within a very militarized state. So when we talk about daily life, I'm talking about my mother who was not able anymore to use the water in the house and like waiting and waiting for electricity and for water to just stay alive with my sibling. And of course, all that, when I want to go back to see how militarization in my body, I live in Amsterdam, and when I look far away from there, it's a lot of also guilt about like, I'm living a good life, and my sibling, not even my friends or my neighbor, like they are not the one who's living a good life. So it's coming from a very personal level to a political level, which as we know, this is a very feminist, like say, like also personal is political. But when it comes to militarization, I think even if you are not affected directly from militarization, it's someone next to you just affected, and we are sharing the same space. So it's something that's very close to us. I just want also to mention that it's very important to have the numbers, and I'm a little bit scared, like we are overusing numbers, and militarization become a number, but not a human story, which is very important. Please don't misunderstand what I'm saying, but also I feel like we can overwhelming ourselves with the numbers, and then we forget about whom we are talking. For example, Russia has been taken the coast side of Syria. They have the airport next to my family house. United States have also base in the Kurdish area, like saying protecting the minority there. Turkish government, they have also administration over a certain part in Syria, in Idlib. There is still weapon running with the support from Saudi Arabia and from Qatar and a little part from Emirates to other rebellion, or at least they don't care about who is going to win this war, because no one is going to win. But this kind of like, we don't want a certain religion to be over other religion in the region. And this is very stupid, because at the end, we need all this religion and people to live together. And 12 years of this kind of practices didn't come to any conclusion yet. And it's happening in other countries. So it's like, it's just a vicious circle, like we are going around. Syria, it's just an example. But when we look today what's happening in Gaza as well, it's turned to be like, oh, we are talking about Muslim Brotherhood who is supporting them, and we forget about the millions of people who have been displaced. And also when we talk about Palestinian in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, with the support of Iran, but also with support of Russia, they have been attack Al Yarmouk camp, which is, it's not camp per se, but it's an area where Palestinians since 1948, when they start to come to Syria, they start to live there. They have been used siege as a weapon to kill them, and then when they didn't die, they attack Mukhayyam Al Yarmouk and they force people to display. So, and I'm talking about the story of my family, myself, my friends. So I don't know if this is enough daily and lived experience to share about militarization in Syria without forgetting that it's transnational issue, and it's not only related to Syria. And again, I want to remind everyone, like, what happened in Ukraine, we felt it quiet in our body and in our heart, especially the Syrian who lives in Europe. because they were telling a story that happened exactly to people in Idlib, northeast Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruda. I really appreciate that you are sharing your personal story here with us. I know it's not a given, and I know it's also hard, but we are here to stand in solidarity. Thank you so much for highlighting also the intersections of militarization and disability justice, and also, of course, like the links to patriarchy, to make sure it's also a cross-border issue. It's a transnational issue that cannot be resolved in one state, but it's an issue that affects us all and that has impacts on our bodies, on our souls, and therefore it's also so important, you know, to like care for each other in the feminist practices. And yes, to make sure there's not just numbers, which is crucial, and that's why we set up this panel like this, right? Like to share the numbers and make sure that we know the data, but also to share the lived experiences of militarization and the climate crisis. Thank you. We do have some time for questions now, and I would like to open up the floor to all of you. We have just heard 6 amazing inputs by our speakers, and maybe you have some questions on clarifications. Please go ahead. Okay, I see 3 for now. Okay, I would start with you, Sheena. And please, please put a concise question out of there and pose it to one of the speakers so that we can make sure to answer these questions in about, well, we have 20 minutes, 15 minutes left. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try. Yeah, thanks to everyone, and thank you specifically to, you already mentioned it, but I want to highlight it again to Rula for mentioning disability and militarization, because I feel like that's not often or ever brought up in spaces. And the long lines we have to walk are already hard in the morning for able-bodied people, and not even to mention disabled and chronically ill people. But my question would more be on the link between racial justice and militarization. It's been mentioned, but there's not one event on racial justice at this COP28, and we know that militarization heavily impacts racialized bodies, mostly black and indigenous bodies. So how can we better make that link? Because I don't remember who mentioned it, but specifically when we talk about militaries protecting property and protecting profits, we have to mention that it's mostly white people benefiting from these profits. So if we don't link racial justice and militarization, where will be all of the racialized bodies that are targeted in increasing militarization? Not to say that white bodies are not also attacked, but it is a racial justice issue. And I know I'm breaking the rule, but I don't know who wants to answer this. So you were all great, but yeah.
I will see in a minute from the panel who could maybe answer to this question. I would collect the other 2 questions as well. I saw, okay, oh my God, okay, so many questions, which is amazing. I would give one question here.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel. This has been really interesting. I'm Nadine. I'm a journalist with The New Arab. And I wanted to ask about kind of the growing trend that we're seeing of militaries claiming to be green by either, I don't know, solar-powered or electric tanks, or to bring it back to the current context of Gaza. Israel has often claimed that with land that it occupies, it will then make the desert bloom or invest in green initiatives. So I wanted to hear, I don't know, again, who would be best to answer it, but what you think about this claim that the military or militarization can never be made green.
Okay, and then one more. You in the pink top at the side. Oh, white top, sorry.
Thank you. So also to follow up on Nadine's question, I came in a few minutes late, so if that was answered, then I'm very sorry, then skip that. But also on the greening of the military specifically, NATO has been talking a lot about green tanks and solar-powered tanks and so on, and vehicles. Is there any evidence that this is a way to access not just private financing for research, but also public financing that's put aside for climate and environmental work in order to basically absorb those finances that we've fought hard for and increase defense budgets further? Thank you.
Okay. As we do not have that much time left, I would stick to those three questions for now and hand it over to our panel to pick one of the questions to reply. Maybe we can have a look. Who feels confident to answer the question on racial justice and militarization? You want to go, Nita?
I was going to do the green question.
Okay, maybe you start with the green and then we can have a look.
Sure. But look, the militarization of policing is incredible in the United States. I actually noticed, however, in the UK that there's now this sort of, if you're thinking, you may be thinking about climate activism, you may be preemptively arrested. There's a new law in the UK about that. And I did spend some time at Standing Rock where those intersections were highlighted. I think the people in movements see the racism in the response, the differential response. But on the claim to be green, militaries have long been interested in reducing their fuel use because it decreases their vulnerability in transiting fuel. So, for instance, when in Afghanistan, fuel had to move from a port in Pakistan into the interior of Afghanistan, which is a landlocked country, people who were moving the fuel, either the Pakistani drivers or U.S. military drivers or other NATO ISAF drivers, were being attacked and some of them injured and killed. So they wanted to decrease vulnerability. So there was a big drive to decrease vulnerability by decreasing fuel use. So that's part of the impetus. And they talk about lethality per gallon as another indicator of success in greening. But as I suggested before you got in the room, it's really, for the U.S., it's less than 1% is renewable energy provision for the military in the U.S. The argument that they're making, sometimes the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, is that when they purchase, for instance, electric non-tactical fleet vehicles, in other words, cars, they're actually pushing commercial industry and decreasing the cost of electric vehicles. But again, I would argue that it's much more efficient to invest directly in the civilian industry. But the main point here is that the greening is great, all for it, but much more fundamental would be restructuring militaries and decreasing their overall size. If 18 to 20% of US military infrastructure is excess, according to the Department of Defense, that can be reduced. There's the real savings.
Thank you. We had another question on also mobilizing financing, particularly also public financing, right, as I understood. So if I understood it correctly, it was about mobilizing finance, and particularly public finance, for also like countering the militarization. Maybe post the question again one more time.
Yeah, no, it's basically, we're fighting for public finances to be available for environmental and climate purposes, and whether the military and defense budgets can absorb some of that by claiming to be doing greening. Because obviously NATO's objective is to achieve the 2% goal across all its member states, and it's actually been improving at its goal since Ukraine, and whether this is part of that objective.
What you mean is, by the military placing themselves in that greening and public climate finance story, are they in some way undermining, or, I mean, we know in terms of public climate finance, as opposed to the climate finance we're talking about here, the big military spenders are outspending. It's something in the order of 6-to-1, military to public climate finance. So that's what they're spending at home. So that doesn't really answer your question. I'm sort of trying to grasp with what you're trying to get at. But, I mean, just to pick up on what Nita was saying, I mean, I'll be people, but we will not see it in our lifetime. By the time we get to 2050, I would say. There is no way that the big militaries can green themselves. The F-35, the new fighter jet, just off the production line, thank you, took 20 years in the making, $2 trillion in the development, will be in operation for the next 40 years, and it drinks 5,800 liters of jet fuel per flying hour. And they're selling them like hotcakes. So that the military are in a conundrum. Okay, they can talk the talk because everybody needs to be talking the talk. How they can come anywhere close to meeting their commitments, other than, as Nisha's talking, the kind of the estate, the back room, the bases, is, to a relative layperson like myself, it's a complete mystery.
Mitzi?
Go ahead. I just wanted to add also, I think you were asking if the military might be able to tap into the climate finance that's starting to flow. 100% they're going to try, right? And especially leaders who want the military to be stronger will try to redirect any climate finance that they get into that. And that's why we need to have, accountability, transparency, all the things people have been saying earlier already, and really, sorry, I'm losing the word in English, guard, watch over, really watch to make sure that they don't do this. There's a better word, but yeah. And then quickly to respond to the racial justice question as well, you're completely correct, Sheena. It really is. The colonizers are white. And colonialism, militarism, that's what's causing the climate crisis. And we've seen across the world, it is black and brown bodies that are being attacked by the military the most. And without talking about that, we won't be able to solve the climate crisis. And I do want to say that there is one event that I know of that talks about environmental racism on the 8th at 2 p.m., but it's in the green zone in the extreme hangout space. So 100% we need to be bringing them into these spaces, into these conversations, because if we don't talk about this, we're leaving a massive analysis that will solve the climate crisis. It's not even just about leaving behind people, it's about not having the solutions. Without BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color at the front line, without the most marginalized at the front line, we're not able to solve the climate crisis.
Thank you, Mitzi. Rula, go ahead.
It's already a very good answer. I don't have anything to add.
I'm just looking at the time. Okay, we have another 7 minutes. I would maybe look for, is there another 1 or 2 questions? Okay. Yes, maybe you two.
Hi, thank you. My name is Zoe. I'm from The Atlantic. I'm a journalist. This question is specifically for Mitzi. I've been talking to some small island nations about their negotiations, and specifically a lot of Pacific island nations. And you mentioned loss and damage. Thank you for bringing that up. In thinking about climate reparations, the elephant in the room does seem to be the U.S. military presence and what is owed in that sense. So I'd just love to hear from you a little bit about why you think, and this is a leading question, this is not something these states feel they can speak about publicly.
And maybe we collect the other question as well, and then...
My question is to either Deborah or Dr. Nita. Either of you can take this. One is, one of you mentioned the G20 emissions. Can you just repeat that, military emissions coming from G20? If you can just repeat that number, I didn't get it. The second is, you talked a little bit more about how this conversation is evolving on this platform. It's being platformed a lot more. Can you give us a little more detail on how the UNFCCC is platforming these discussions on demilitarization? And if they've, since the Kyoto Protocol, if there's been any initiative to talk about it in the negotiations itself?
So it's tricky because states are either scared to call out the U.S. military because of the power and threats that they bring, or, and I can't talk about the other Pacific Island nations, but if they're like my country, they're puppets of the US and the US military, where they welcome and want to have more US militarization because it brings in money. And when we talk about loss and damage, it's actually really scary because the US military does give aid for loss and damage, but that is often in the form of debt. And their military will come and help our military to address the loss and damages that's happening in our country. But then what that actually looks like is just, again, militarization of our lands and making people, most marginalized people, more in danger and threatened. We also see that it often comes with neoliberal policies that allow more extraction of our resources, which again causes more destruction of the environment, leading to more vulnerability to the climate crisis and more emissions of the climate crisis as well.
Yeah, and I was also just going to add to Mitzi, there was a report published, now this is where the stat, there was a report published at the beginning of last week, the webinar we were on. You need to look up the work of Patrick Bigger and Kem at Commonwealth. So the US organization is the Climate and Community Project, Patrick Bigger, and Commonwealth. We did a joint webinar, and Mitzi was on it, last week, and they have come up with numbers, reparation numbers, for the US and the UK. And I think in the case of the US, is it 100? I'm not going to speak to it. Look it up. It's all there. I should know the numbers, I'm sorry. And the other thing was how this conversation is starting to filter through in terms of the UNFCCC. Is that it? I mean, in terms of this collective pressure that has been sort of making itself felt since Glasgow, and it's really only since Glasgow. And then we had the invasion of Ukraine. And the invasion of Ukraine was the moment where, and it wasn't Iraq or Afghanistan or other conflicts, it was Ukraine, that was the moment where the door opened and suddenly the media could see, we could all see with our own eyes, the climate impact of conflict. And now, as I say, we're seeing with Gaza. And so in that moment, from that kind of Ukraine conflict moment at the beginning of that year, we have all, there are organizations here, SEALs, we've all been able to get into the blue zone, get onto side event panels, organize them and start to raise this, and then pick up conversations with key decision makers in different parts of the UNFCCC process. So we are pushing for an IPCC special report into the role of the global military in climate change, possibly conflict emissions. We want to get it on this AR7 cycle. There's a meeting in January. Anybody here who has any influence, please consider raising this topic of military emissions in peace and war, and if it needs to be just conflict emissions, then conflict emissions. We've submitted to the global stocktake, so it's on, and we've, the Secretariat, the global stocktake know that this is a topic, it's in there. I doubt it will be on for this year, but we will keep the pressure up. We're also calling for a special submission to the UNFCCC, to the special scientific body, for them to reappraise what's going on. In short, we are pushing hard, and the topic is rising up the agenda, primarily because we're seeing more conflicts. And I just want to say that climate change has presented this terrible opportunity for those of us that have been talking about military spending for a long time, to get military spending into the mix, so that people understand that it's military spending, it's the big spenders that are enabling the emissions. And we are going in the wrong direction. I hope that answers your question.
You have 1 minute. Yeah. Very quickly, what is on the agenda, clearly, at COP, and is on NATO's agenda, and on the US agenda, is the climate security nexus, they're calling it, right? That they're arguing that climate change will cause war and insecurity. And what I think we've tried to highlight here is that war is one of the drivers of climate change. And I think that that's the thing that has to be clearly articulated. And by war, we mean not just the direct fighting, but the military-industrial production and the consequences of combat on environments. So that climate change is not actually going to drive war and insecurity necessarily. We can make it so by our responses to climate change, but what we have to do is really understand the contribution of military industry, military use of fuel, the consequences of conflict, such as in all these the case studies, that's a driver of climate change.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for your questions and being here with us today. All our panelists will also be outside. If you have some more questions, please feel free to stay and have this conversation with us. With that, I want to thank you for participating in our side event. I think our feminist demands were very clear. We need a reallocation of military spending. We need transparency of military missions. We need to listen and also advocate for the lived experiences of those that are experiencing and living the lived realities of militarization and the climate crisis, and in order to stand in solidarity. Today is the day on gender and climate finance, so let's stand in solidarity and let's address the elephant in the room, and that's rampant militarization, and let's together demand demilitarization for gender and climate justice. Thank you so much for coming.